Welcome to The Criminologist, the podcast dedicated to educating and entertaining our listeners. We bring you subject matter experts from around the world and share the latest and greatest evidence-based practices and interventions to help individuals desist from a life of crime and delinquency. We do so by painting an accurate picture of that journey from the perspective of the justice-involved individual. Too often, our perceptions of those individuals are tainted by media-driven caricatures created to sell newspapers or movie tickets. This adds little to a healthy dialogue as to how to best address criminality and the reintegration process. This podcast avoids stereotypes and biases in favor of the lived experiences of those we can best learn from. Now, please, welcome the host of The Criminologist, Joseph Arvidsson.
Hello, and welcome to episode 74 of the Criminologist podcast. Happy to have you all with us today. Coming at you this episode, sans any guest nor supervision of the old fictitious caseload. If you are newer to the show, I would encourage you to go back and check out some of those season 1, maybe even season 2 episodes where we were using the device of, again, supervising a fictitious caseload of mock clients to illustrate some of the themes of the show. And if you did not pick up on it the first listen through, I had some fun with this project, and all of the clientele assume the moniker of infamous movie bad guys and bad gals from cinema history. So see if you can't place as many of those as you can, ranging from Mia Wallace to Clarence Brown, Elvira Hancock, Annie Wilkes, Henry Hill, Patrick Bateman, just to name a few. So again, if you are newer to the show, go back, give those a listen. Again, I really try to model those interventions in a way that hopefully would resonate with the listener. I reached out and asked you all what you preferred the supervision of caseload over the fantastic subject matter guests that we have subsequently lined up. And the consensus was you preferred the subject matter expert. So I kind of got away from that aspect of the show, but maybe think of that as the early lost episodes, if you will. Go back, give those a listen. And again, what we were really doing was highlighting those evidence-based practices, a lot of cognitive behavioral interventions, hopefully in an entertaining way. I mentioned we then dovetailed, and I was getting really fortunate to line up true subject matter experts from around the world. If, again, you listened as of late, you hopefully caught my fantastic interview with the amazing Brad Bogue back on August 28th of this year, episode 70. I really encourage you all to go back and listen to that episode where Brad and I took a deep dive on the need principle and sort of reimagining the need principle, or as Brad put it, re-examining the sanctity of the needs principle. And if you don't mind, I would like to go back and revisit some of the themes of that episode. That interview really, really resonated with me. Again, I've mentioned sort of the evolution of this podcast. We started out highlighting, if not outright promoting, the Risk-Need-Responsivity model. But then, of course, we also showcased aspects of the emerging Desistance model, more of those strength-based models versus the arguably risk-averse approach to the Risk-Need-Responsivity model. As of late, we've really been teasing out the role that trauma plays in the approaches that we take with justice-involved individuals. But again, that episode with Brad really resonated with me, so I wanted to circle back, get back to our Risk-Need-Responsivity roots by highlighting some of the things that stood out for me in Brad's interview. So if you would indulge me, if you will, I'm going to present sort of a best of or highlights of that interview with Brad, which again, if you haven't listened to it, please go back, listen to episode 70, our interview with Brad Bogue. Let's begin with Brad's insights into the role of low self-control. Here's a clip from that interview. Have a listen.
The R&R model was developed prior to the publication of Godfredson and Hershey's book. Prior to that kind of very conclusive evidence and knowledge that low self-control is a major, you might say, criminogenic need. And it's not found in the model that was formulated by Bonta and Andrews. So what you see there is, it's not obvious. I think it is there latently, and I've talked to Dr. Bonta and Dr. Andrews before he passed away about this, and they acknowledged it was probably unfortunate timing that they didn't have insight into that at that time, that knowledge base that emerged in 1990. So what they have is a pretty good proxy, I think, for low self-control is criminal history. Most people look at criminal history as, well, that's static and you can't change that, right? Well, that's pretty true. I mean, you could increase the amount of criminal history. You could increase the amount of versatility in the history, but you can't really diminish what's happened already, all right? So what the developmental psychologists and theorists around low self-control say is that it manifests, one of its most common manifestations is unruly behavior, and AKA criminal behavior. And that you can, another way that it manifests is accident proneness. Those are two very gross manifestations of low self-control. So you can look at the versatility of someone's criminal history, or you can look at the extensiveness of it to determine if there's, that's a big, juicy clue whether they have issues with low self-control or poor self-regulation. Those terms, as far as I can tell, are pretty synonymous. And what are we talking about when we're talking about low self-control? Or we're talking about something that's developmental and it's exquisite. It's orchestral in its development. It's over time. And we talk about people learning self-control and self-regulation skills in a sequence over time. And much of that development is occurring during adolescence, early adolescence, mid-adolescence, and late adolescence, and into the mid-20s, which happens to coincide with the high-risk period for involvement in criminal behavior. So most of us who are involved in criminal behavior of some type or another, whether it was shoplifting or soaping windows or doing something, or, a little bit more. I mean, it's a long continuum, but the research, on the longitudinal research, with representative samples of the population show that most of us were involved in it, and most of us, 80% or so, desisted by the time we hit mid-20s. So that J curve they talk about happens right in there at the same time that all this wonderful development's taking place. However, sometimes some of us miss some of the buses, the developmental buses, and maybe we're just preoccupied with, hormones and sexual politics, or we're getting involved in drugs at pre-algebra, and we just kind of check out, and we aren't really mindful of the shop anymore. And by the time algebra rolls around next year, we're hosed. We've missed that developmental bus, if you will, for finer abstract thinking, which is what algebra symbolizes. So, signs or facets of low self-control are impulsivity, poor emotional regulation, risk-taking, preference for simple tasks, preference for physical over mental activity, taking others' perspective, poor consequential thinking, and temper problems, flying off the handle, right? And the list is much larger. There's much to be learned about this. So it's a many-headed hydra, low self-control. And it's not explicit in the central 8. All right, that's the gist of what I want us to consider how and what we need to do with this. How do we rectify this? Is this something that should be rectified? When I've presented this to 2 large audiences, once in Minnesota to a statewide conference and another to ICA, it went over like a wet, a lead balloon. It went over just like when I was first introducing R&R back in the early 90s, the beginning of the 90s, to probation officers. If it got any reaction, it was hostile or passive aggressive. And so I had a similar feeling when I started talking about, hey, look at this. And I haven't finished with it. My thesis is there's something was overlooked. There is something that we can do about it, and it will possibly pay dividends. It's not just remedying cosmetics. It's not just correcting something semantically, or getting it correct. It goes way beyond that.
Lots to unpack there. This is one of the reasons I love speaking to Brad. He always gets me thinking deeper and deeper. Low self-control, low self-regulation. Again, Brad did a good job of pointing out how we utilize criminal history almost as a proxy for that, but so much we're missing when we do that. I have heard practitioners and even trainers of various risk assessments talk about how criminal history is static and there's really nothing we can do about that because it can only get worse. But it's the closest we come in the Risk-Need-Responsivity model to drilling down on an individual's low self-control, which, as you just heard Brad say, is so important in the process. And now, continuing with Brad's critique of the need principle within the Risk-Need-Responsivity model, let's revisit what he had to say about the central 8 and all of those criminogenic variables that we are asking practitioners to both assess and case plan around.
It renders that model, which is has some really good logic and some good empirical underpinnings, notwithstanding the one I talked about, self-control being overlooked, that it's just too cumbersome. It's not. So that leads me to this kind of jump in logic is, rather than try to be okay or good enough at 8 different domains, in programming, why don't we just get good at a couple? And if I wanted to know which ones to get good at, well, as an empirist, I would look at the data, which I have done for 30 some years, looking at the results of instruments like the LSI and Compass. And what I've seen is consistent when it's system level data. It's not a special population, like we're going to go in and assess sex offenders, or we're going to assess, domestic violence or something, looking at that. When it's a general heterogenic sample, system data, representative sample, invariably the high domains are criminal history and companions. Criminal history and companions. Criminal history. I'm sick of seeing it. It's always the same. So that would suggest to me that maybe we look at that. And what are we talking when we talk about criminal history and companions? Essentially, I believe we're talking about low self-control and self-regulation, which is the mother of all these other problems: substance abuse, the problem of immediate gratification, adopting criminal attitudes and orientation from others. All of that emanates out of low self-control, because there's so much liability when you're an adult and you have missed a number of buses developmentally, that you don't have the same capacity to navigate, and you're going to get marginalized more easily in various situations. You're going to be more at risk if you get placed in an incarcerated setting, to picking up more criminogenic attitudes, to picking up more antisocial practices or skills.
Criminal history and companions. Criminal history and companions. That's the theme Brad has seen in 30 years of critiquing assessments and looking at populations. The common denominator with high-risk individuals are those two domains. Do me a favor. Do yourself a favor. If you're a practitioner, particularly one who adheres to the Risk-Need-Responsivity model, pull some of those assessments, whether it's the COMPASS or the LSCMI or whatever other risk-need assessment you're doing. Look at your high-risk clients and just do an anecdotal survey, if you will, of a handful, a random sampling of those high-risk clients, and see how many of those individuals are not, to Brad's point, consistently scoring high in the domains of criminal history and companions. Criminal history and companions. And to Brad's point, would it behoove us to get good at focusing on a couple of things rather than the smorgasbord of domains, the central 8, that we're asked to case plan around? Again, Brad noted he's never really seen that, where somebody knocks off that highest domain and says, okay, now I'm going to work on the second domain. And they knock off that second domain and say, now I'm going down to that third domain. Frankly, I see folks adhering to their weekend to-do list with more rigor than they do to following through on a client's risk-need assessment when they're tasked with addressing those 8 criminogenic variables. Let's see then, pick up on what Brad was talking about as to companions. And I think this is really, really, really crucial.
Social support. So I call it social support, not companions, because I think that's the underlying essence of the domain. And what we know about social support, check this out. It's the biggest moderator in all psychosocial treatment. It doesn't matter whether people are there for phobias, they're there for depression. It doesn't matter what. The biggest factor that moderates the outcome, irrespective of the intervention, is social support. People that have good social support do better, and people that don't. What is good social support? We also have the benefit now of 50, 60 years of research on this topic. And it's where it's emerged and gone, again, with the help of big data, the Framington study, for instance, and other studies that just are amazing to look at, how impactful social support is on our lives, day in and day out. And when you start unpacking it, there's a handful or two of very core principles that are worth understanding, which we have yet to really grapple with in our world, I think, adequately. And I say our world, I mean social services in general, education in general. So it's this big moderator, and when it looks good, when it's working, it is bigger networks, more people that you see on a regular basis. And notwithstanding the size of your network, it is more disclosing people in your network, people that are comfortable being vulnerable with you. So this lets out a lot of cults, it lets out gangs, it lets out rural fundamental, while that you may get a quick overnight increase in the size via those contexts, you don't get the self-disclosing vulnerability. So, and then the third criteria, which is to me as good as mother's milk, is diversity. But it's diversity in its total sense. It's not diversity like racial diversity. It's diversity in age. It's diversity in education. It's diversity. Is the more diverse someone's network, the more self-disclosing, and the larger the network, the more powerful it is in what they call direct effects of social support. Then there's the indirect or protective effects of social support. So they're both present with social support. Direct effects help people increase their self-worth. They increase their flexibility. They increase their sense of agency and empowerment. Those are direct effects of social support. Buffering or indirect effects protect them, provide them resiliency and the ability to spring back more quickly and more readily. So I would submit to a conversation and open and embrace anybody that wants to follow up and contact me or Joe or whatever and just say, can we talk more about this? Is that we should maybe consider getting good at those two things and forget everything else, basically. Not forget it. It's there. Treat it nominally and address it when it's acute, but that's not our core. I think our core in working with people that are marginalized and, and are at risk is to really learn about self-regulation skills and learn about social support. When we talk about the primary responsivity principle of working with CBT, there is a hand-in-glove fit to working with self-control. We have not surfaced that narrative fully yet. That's why it works. The evidence out there that was gathered through meta-analysis after many is very consistent. But what's the need that it's addressing has not been consistent, and I think it's a misunderstanding to focus on the flower or even the fruit, for that matter, antisocial attitudes, rather than the roots, which is low self-control.
And I just loved how Brad referred to that as social support, which I feel we are really missing in assessment world and risk-need-responsivity world. As noted, as is Brad, I am a master trainer of the level of service case management inventory. I know the LSCMI inside and out. And when we look at that domain of companions, there's only 4 questions to measure this domain or this area of an individual's life. And those 4 questions really break down into 2 halves. One half, you're asked as a practitioner to examine the negative individuals in your client's life. So you're looking at negative criminal acquaintances or criminal friends and the degree to that they have these negative influencers in their lives. On the flip side, they are asked to look at the presence of prosocial friends and prosocial acquaintances in a client's life. And again, Brad talked about this sort of buffering effect. Those individuals buffer against risk. But again, as a trainer, I can tell you that the things we look at are not nearly as sensitive, if you will, as to the themes you just heard Brad talking about when he talked about those networks and those individuals being vulnerable and somebody that your client could disclose to, that whole self-disclosure element. Nor does it get at the diversity that Brad talked about, diversity in age and diversity in so many different things that they can bring to the table. It's really just, are they involved in the criminal justice system or not? And that is the definition of the standard, if you will, that we go with when saying, yeah, that would count as a prosocial friend, or yeah, that would count as a prosocial individual. My point being, we're really not scratching the surface on this variable, which, as Brad just pointed out, is so critical in the change process. Brad also talked about the importance of strong social support networks augmenting the resiliency of the client, that is to say, their ability to bounce back, if you will. And if you're listening and you're familiar with the desistance literature or a practitioner that practices the themes of desistance, you know how important resiliency is in the desistance process. Again, a cool little crossover here because, again, in desistance world, we know the importance of augmenting social capital. Not suppressing it, which sadly too often is the case in Risk-Need-Responsivity world, playing whack-a-mole with those negative companions, but rather how can we augment social support, augment social capital, augment those individuals in a client's life, which will afford them those off-ramps out of criminality. Hey, thanks for indulging me with this revisit of Brad's recent episode. Again, it just resonated me as a practitioner and as a trainer so much. And as Brad said, let's re-examine this. He talked about how this really didn't go over too well when he's presented it at ICCA and at a leadership conference here in my home state of Minnesota. And he also pointed out kind of the same reaction that he got in the early 90s when he was promoting and unveiling to many of us the Risk-Need-Responsivity model. So let's take a good, long, hard look in the mirror and see if we shouldn't re-examine the way we do business. You heard Brad throw out the invitation. If any of you listeners would like to go down this rabbit hole with us, reach out to the show at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com. Let's continue this very worthwhile conversation. Back next week with a fresh episode. Very excited to announce my scheduled guest is Anna Savgi. Anna is a senior lecturer in criminology at the University of Essex. She is a consultant and expert in mafia studies, organized crime, cocaine trafficking, policing, and high security. Really looking forward to talking to Anna. She'll be joining us from London, England. Please tune in for that. Hey, speaking of upcoming guest, it's happening, folks. Fergus McNeil will be joining us in October. If you have questions for Fergus or Anna, shoot me an email in advance at thecriminologistpodcast@gmail.com, and we'll try to weave your questions into those interviews. So stay tuned for those two fantastic guests coming up. In the meantime, you may also contact the show or reach out to us through our website, theparagongroup.llc.com, for training or presentations as to evidence-based practices or, of course, the topic of desistance from crime. Remember to follow us through our Facebook page and our Instagram pages at The Criminologist Podcast. New fun images are being added to those feeds all the time. You don't want to miss out. The Criminologist Media Group is also on Twitter at Crim Media Group. That's CRIM Media Group. Go ahead and give us a follow. You can connect with me, Joseph Arvidsson, on LinkedIn and follow both the Criminologist Podcast and the Paragon Group on our LinkedIn pages. Lastly, if you've not already done so, check out and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Criminologist, for additional content as to the themes of this podcast. Merchandise is available. Reach out if interested. And if you believe in what we're doing on the show, if you're part of the movement, please spread the word. Tell a friend or a coworker or a colleague about us. Ask them to subscribe to the show, and of course, do so yourself if you've not already done so. And always remember, folks, there's no them, there's only us.
Jim Collins, I think, good to great. He had in there a chapter on the hedgehog principle, and that the hedgehog is really a very old mammal in terms of evolution, and it's survived primarily because it does one thing really well. It rolls into a ball and it protects itself when it's threatened. End of story, And if we could get that way, and I believe we could with social support, I know we could, is develop, because there's lots of chops that we could develop and use that we aren't. And it's easy to measure over time. Social support does not elude us into like self-regulation or antisocial attitudes. It's not that elusive. It's very concrete and tangible. And there's many techniques that lend themselves to tracking that data. We could get really good, remarkably good at it, and do our local communities and our population and our stakeholders a really great service by getting good at that, as well as self-regulation skills.
The Criminologist Podcast is a production of the Paragon Group, LLC. For speaking engagements, interviews, program design, or training opportunities, please visit us at theparagongroup.llc.com. If you enjoyed the show, you can find more content and videos on our YouTube channel, The Criminologist. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Both the Criminologist Podcast and the Criminologist channel are brought to you by the Criminologist Media Group. Be sure to give us a 5-star review, and thanks for listening.
The thoughts, statements, and opinions of the host and cast members do not necessarily reflect the views of their employers and are those of the host and cast themselves. Any discussion regarding client statements, behaviors, actions, or crimes are purely fictional and are used only for the purposes of example. Any examples that could be deemed to be related to an actual individual or individuals are incidental.